Hi friends, I'm Elise, and today my pumpkin chai and I are going to talk about my fall recommendations. So this list is full of books that I have already read, split up into 4 different categories. The first category is spooky. These are books that kind of creeped me out. Next is fun, and these are books that I had a fun time reading. The third category is atmosphere. These books have the perfect fall atmosphere. And the last category is vibes, and those are just the books that have the vibes. Starting with the spooky category, the first book in this list is Horrid by Katrina Leno. This is a YA horror. After Jane's father passes away, she and her mother move back to her mom's childhood home in Maine, and she starts going to school there. She has to deal with some bullying and people just telling her that there's something weird about the house that they're living in. Besides the fact that this book takes place in New England in the fall, it's also really creepy. There's some pretty spooky stuff that happens, especially towards the end, and it really freaked me out. And the last book that I have in the spooky category is Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. In this book, Maggie moves back into the manor that her family lived in very briefly when she was younger to renovate it, even though her father told her never to go back to this house. We follow 2 timelines, one in the present, when Maggie is an adult, and one in the past, when Maggie lived in the home with her family. But the past timeline is technically excerpts from the novel her father wrote about their experience there. Because one night something happened and it drove the family away from the house for good. I just remember feeling so spooked with this book, and there's a song in here that is talked about multiple times. I read this book back when it came out in 2020, and to this day, I cannot listen to that song without getting chills. The second category is fun, and these were books that I just had a really good time reading. The first is one that I found really funny, and that is Angelica Frankenstein Makes Her Match by Sally Thorne. This is a historical romance, and it follows the Frankenstein siblings, Victor and Angelica. Victor is trying to make history by reanimating a corpse. Meanwhile, Angelica is getting older and has yet to find a husband, which, according to society standards at that time, is not a good thing. And because no living man is up to her standards, she decides to build her own man. So together, she and her brother Victor gather a variety of parts from a variety of corpses to build her ideal man, and then she reanimates him. This book was so funny and surprisingly smutty. There was lots of talk of the big old manor that the siblings live in, carriages, candlesticks, and corpses. There's even a pig named Belladonna that just steals the show. The next 2 books are both by the same author, and that is How to Sell a Haunted House and Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Now, I rated both of these books 3 stars. I don't really like Grady Hendrix's writing. However, I can definitely appreciate the stories that he creates. I know a lot of people love him. So despite the fact that these are not my favorite books, I do still want to recommend them. And I have them included in the fun category because, if anything, they are a good time. How to Sell a Haunted House follows 2 siblings who are grappling with what to do with their parents' home after their parents pass away. And there's lots of, let's just say, the house has some secrets that the siblings have to overcome. And Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This one takes place in the 90s, and it follows these suburban moms that are in a book club that love reading about horror and true crime. One day a stranger comes into their community, and the main character suspects that he may be a vampire and the culprit to some disappearances going on. And the last book in the fun category is Clown in a Cornfield by Adam Cesar. This book was just a fun time all around. If you are a fan of slashers, I think that you would get a kick out of this book. It is gory, and it's fast-paced, and it's thrilling. I was definitely pleasantly surprised when I read it. Category number 3 is atmosphere. These are the books that are, the plot is okay, but you're really there for the atmosphere. And honestly, I don't think anyone is going to be surprised with these recommendations. The first is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This book follows a retired soldier who receives word that their childhood friend is not doing so well. So they travel to the rundown manor where their friend lives to pay their respects, see if there's anything they can do to assist. And along the way, our main character meets a mycologist who studies mushrooms. This book is just chock full of imagery. Think wet, dank, fungi, decay. It's a novella, so it's pretty short, and this is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. The next atmospheric recommendation, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This book I also only rated 3 stars. At the time that I read this, it wasn't really my favorite. However, I definitely appreciate the atmosphere in this book. Very similar to What Moves the Dead. Think rundown manors, think wet, dank, decay. There are a couple scenes in here that are pretty horrific, pretty gross. So this is also similar to What Moves the Dead in the sense that we have a character who's visiting family. This book follows Noemi. She's a socialite living her best life. One day she receives a letter from her cousin who recently married, begging her to come save her. So of course Noemi travels to this home, and the people there, they're trying to keep her cousin away from her. She's got very limited access to her cousin. Her cousin has a very strict schedule, and they're treating her like she's a very fragile person. This book is very mysterious and super atmospheric. And the next two are the love story duology Anatomy and Immortality by Dana Schwartz. These books are historical YA, and they follow Hazel Sinnott in the early 1800s in Scotland. And Hazel wants to be a surgeon, which at the time is completely unheard of for a woman, especially being set in Scotland. The second book actually takes place also in London. I think it starts in Scotland and ends in London. It's just the perfect setting for a dark and dreary story. The final and biggest category is vibes. You either have the vibes or you don't, and these books have them. The first book in this category is Written in Bone, Hidden Stories We Leave Behind by Sue Black. As you may have guessed, this book talks about bones and what scientists can tell from a person's life and the circumstances of their death when studying their remains. This book was super fascinating. The author goes into a number of different case studies talking about instances where human remains were found and what scientists were able to determine about how they died purely based off studying their bones. Some of the stories were a little hard to read because they do involve children, so trigger warning if you do decide to pick this one up, that there is discussion of death of children. But overall, if you're scientifically minded and this is something that interests you, I would highly recommend it. The next book on this list is Dracula's Child by J.S. Barnes. This book I absolutely loved, and it was my first ever e-ARC approval on NetGalley. This book is basically a follow-up to Dracula by Bram Stoker, and J.S. Barnes does a really good job of matching the tone of Dracula as well as how the story is written in the epistolary format. After Jonathan and Mina survived their ordeal in Transylvania against Dracula years ago, they now have a son called Quincy, and there's darkness surrounding Dracula that Jonathan and Mina have to face. And now, of course, it's not just their lives at stake, but the life of their son. The next book is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book I'm sure you've heard of. I know a lot of people rave about it. This book focuses on Costanza. She is one of Dracula's brides. If I remember correctly, it is also written in an epistolary format, basically letters from Costanza explaining why she had to kill Dracula. It's interesting because they're written in kind of a love story type way, so it's very obvious that she loved Dracula, but he's a terrible being, so it had to happen. The next book is The Witches of New York by Amy McKay. This book also takes place in, I believe, the 1800s. This book follows a couple witches in New York that own a tea shop. They provide tinctures and cures, balms, and all sorts of remedies to the socialites that live there. And one day an unexpected guest arrives at their tea shop and causes a bit of a stir. I really enjoyed this book. Again, the vibes are perfection. Now, if you read The Lost Apothecary and just felt like something was missing, I suggest you try The Witches of New York because somewhat similar storylines, but I think what The Lost Apothecary was trying to do, The Witches of New York did really well. Next up is Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. This book follows Daisy as she attends her grandmother's birthday party with her family at her grandmother's home, the secluded cliffside manor. Her nan ends up dying and somebody in the house did it, and they have to figure out who did it as more people are dropping dead. This book has perfect spooky season vibes because it's dark and it's rainy, and it also takes place right around Halloween. The next book is Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. This was my first TJ Klune and it was 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. This book follows Wallace. He dies and meets a reaper who is sent to retrieve him and take him to this peculiar tea shop. It's kind of like a bit of a limbo. It's so cozy. If you love sitting by the fireplace and drinking tea, then this book is for you. And the final book that I'm recommending to you is The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. This book I just read earlier this month. It follows Florence Day, whose eccentric family ran a funeral home while she was growing up. Some things happened and Florence escaped to New York to follow her dream of becoming a writer. In present day, her next deadline is fast approaching, and when she requests an extension from her new editor, it is swiftly declined. declined. She's a romance author and is dealing with a really tough breakup, so naturally she kind of lost her spark. She doesn't believe in love anymore, and she's dealing with writer's block. And to top it all off, she receives a call from her family. Her beloved father has passed away, and she needs to go back home to the small town in South Carolina where she grew up and help her family put together the funeral. Now, another thing about Florence is she has a special gift. She can see ghosts. Who does she run into in his spectral form when she goes home? Her new editor. So this is a book where it actually takes place in the spring, but because of the ghosts and the small town vibe and the funeral home, it really has those autumnal vibes. And this was a book that it took me a little bit to get into, but once I did, this was a book that I had a hard time putting down. When I did put it down, I missed. I literally had an ache in my chest. I missed the characters in the small town. I just wanted to jump back into this story, and I was a little heartbroken when it finally ended. All right, friends, those are all the books that I have on my fall recommendations list. If you've read any of these books and you agree, let me know in the comments. And if you have any other books that you'd like to add, let me know because I should probably read them. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and until next time, bye.